My name is Nick Waxman. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Wiener Library and the Pearce Institute to the workshop this afternoon. I'm trying to undermine various national stereotypes. First of all, apologies for running late. And we'll also hear something about German humour later, I think, so that should also break down some existing or not stereotypes. The topic, as you know, is about the relationship between power and laughter in totalitarian dictatorships in the 20th century, focusing on the one hand on officially sanctioned humour and its reception, but we'll also have some discussion on a paper on humour from below, if you will, or illicit humour. When we think of Mussolini's Italy, or Stalin's Soviet Union, or Hitler's Germany, laughter is not the first thing that comes to mind, unless you happen to be watching The Great Dictator or To Be or Not to Be. Nonetheless, humour, its control and use by the state, and its subversion by some members of the public, played a far bigger role than has often been acknowledged. Take Nazi Germany, where attempts to control laughter were made right at the very beginning, in an early sign of the regime's total claim on society. One of the very first legislative acts in March 1933 was the so-called Malicious Attacks Decree, which threatened anyone guilty of a statement, quote, of a factual nature which is untrue or grossly exaggerated, with imprisonment. This applied directly to jokes about the new regime and its leaders. As Ian Kershaw has commented, the age-old sport of venting spleen on the government had become a punishable crime. But even the most draconian punishment could not stop jokes about Goebbels' statue, about Goering's girth, or about Hitler's sex life, and they continued to make the rounds in Germany. Though at what cost to the regime is another question, and perhaps one we might look at. Whether the regime in Nazi Germany was any more successful at using its monopoly over the public sphere to push its own brand of officially sanctioned humour and to use it as an instrument of inclusion and exclusion is one of the topics that Patrick Merziger will be talking about later in his talk. Humour was so prevalent in the Third Reich that it penetrated even into the darkest corners of the dictatorship, the concentration camp. First, there was the official humour of the regime, which was meant to offer the SS some respite and distraction after a long day of violence in the camp, cladding the concentration camps with a thin veneer of normality. In Auschwitz, for example, the authorities put on plenty of light entertainment for the SS troops. An old theatre on the campgrounds was regularly used for shows featuring dancers and acrobats, jugglers and jokers. As late as December 1944, that is just a few weeks before the death marches from Auschwitz, Jupp Hussells, famous across the Third Reich as an amiable film comedian and as the sunny voice of German breakfast radio, arrived in Auschwitz to entertain the troops with his harmless jokes. Then there was the coarse humour of the SS guards, when they were amongst themselves in the camp or in the canteen. Individual SS men would often demonstrate their cold-bloodedness towards prisoners, perhaps the most highly prized asset in the masculine and martial world of the SS, by mocking the living and by violating the dead. What passed for SS humour knew no bounds of decency. The SS chief of the Majdanek crematorium, for example, often indulged in macabre jokes, waving body parts of corpses at passing female guards, hoping to get a rise out of the supposedly weak women. For the prisoners, meanwhile, jokes, sarcasm, and gallows humour offered a brief outlet for fears and frustrations. Occasionally, the SS allowed cabaret performances by prisoners in an official way, briefly blurring the strict boundaries between oppressors and oppressed. More often, though, prisoners joked amongst themselves, mocking SS men or making dark jokes about their own fate. Here, humour could function as a defence mechanism that distanced prisoners, if only for a moment, from the daily terror inside. Nothing was off limits here, neither the food, which in Sachsenhausen, the disgusting herring paste which was dished out to prisoners was known as cat shit, nor the daily SS humiliations. In Dachau, the strip in prisoners' hair, shaved across in the middle, was known as the lice motorway, nor death itself. In Buchenwald, prisoners often joked about the shape of the clouds coming from the crematorium, making jokes about how you could tell from the type of the smoke what kind of prisoners were being murdered. These then were some of the functions and manifestations of humour in the camps and in a dictatorship like the Third Reich more generally, ranging between officially sanctioned or at least officially tolerated humour and its subversion. And several of these themes will be picked up this afternoon far more expertly by our three speakers. And what we're going to do is, I think we're going to take each paper one by one, as it were, and then leave time for questions after each paper. We will then have a round table towards the end of the seminar, where we will hopefully draw together and broaden out some of the themes which we've talked about before. So it's my pleasure, first of all, to introduce to you Stephen Gundel, who's Professor of Film and Television Studies at the University of Warwick, and who's written very widely on mass culture and film in Italy in the 20th century, including his forthcoming book, Mussolini's Dream Factory, Film Stardom in Fascist Italy. So please give it up, as it were, for Stephen Gundel.
Welcome to this final roundtable session. We have three superb speakers. All we're lacking is a round table because we have this extremely serviceable oblong. The speakers are Julia Lovell from, well, all the speakers have a connection to Birkbeck next door. I can't imagine why. That's worked out. Julia Lovell teaches the history of China at Birkbeck and is the author most recently of the prize-winning book, The Opium War, Drugs, Dreams and the Making of China. Jane Kaplan, who is Emeritus Fellow of St Anthony's College, Oxford, and a visiting professor at Birkbeck, once taught me, I'm very proud to say, and is the author of many volumes which concentrate on the history of Nazi Germany and the documentation of individual identity in modern Europe. And Jan Ruger, who teaches modern European history at Birkbeck, is the author of The Great Naval Game, Britain and Germany in the Age of Empire. And while in these introductions we tend not to mention the scores of articles that speakers have written in his case, I think it probably is worth mentioning he's also the author of Laughter and War in Berlin, which appeared in History Workshop Journal for 2009. Which Jane
Yes,
edited.
I'm proud to say I edited it.
Excellent.
So,
We're so underprepared, we don't even know which order we're speaking in. Shall we just start with?
Okay.
But before you do, I mean, I'll just say that each of the speakers will speak for a short period of time, and that will leave plenty of time for a discussion more broadly among everyone who has attended today. Yeah.
I think I'm just going to try and make 3 points in terms of trying to see how we can bring together these different historiographies. and wonderful examples. And the first one is about continuities in German history. The second one is about totalitarian/fascist ideas or theories of humor and laughter. And the third one is really about power. Is every joke a tiny revolution, or is it a counter-revolution? So first, continuities in German history. Patrick's paper really made me rethink what did the Nazis think they had learned from what they saw as the great fiasco of the First World War. And the collapse, as they saw it, of the home front during the First World War. Because clearly that is when they turn to laughter and humor in their public sphere, what they're trying to avoid. They're trying to avoid some form of resistance or subversive movement to use instruments in the way in which they perceived to have been used during the First World War at the home front. And so my time frame is slightly longer than yours, Patrick, and I came to a slightly different conclusion. As persuasive as I thought the learning process that you painted from the 30s to the 40s was, but there's clearly also a different, longer learning process. And that longer learning process starts with an appreciation of how the relationship between laughter and power was dealt with during what the Nazis always turned to when they, as their sort of, if you like, originating experience of what went wrong in the recent German past. And what happened during the First World War was that the Kaiser's leadership had a very clear idea of what forms of laughter it did and what it didn't want to see in the public sphere. And there was this now seemingly ludicrous idea of German seriousness. So the Kaiser said, there shall not be any entertainment in times of war. I want my Berliners in particular, but I want all the Germans to pray in church for our troops and a speedy victory on the battlefield. And that then is that remains the official position, propped up theoretically by ideas about German seriousness and German humor and German laughter, which is the opposite of laughter, namely that you appreciate the seriousness of the situation and its dramatic, world-ranging impact, and nonetheless you remain calm. And that is, if you like, subverted by forms of public humor. And only very, very towards the end of the First World War is that allowed to. There's a process during which subversive forms of humor, precisely because officials can't decide whether it is subversive or not, are allowed to be staged, are allowed to take place. And my interpretation is that is precisely the switch that the Nazis think they learn from, namely that you have to allow for entertainment, you have to allow for popular forms of humor from the beginning. There's a famous Goebbels quote when he instructs some of his propaganda administrators and press officials, and he says, don't indoctrinate them, don't lecture them, entertain them. And that is not in response to the sort of amateur theatres that flourish and that I appreciate play an important role, but that's from very early on at the literally the first months of the Third Reich, and that's in response to the historical experience of the First World War and what the Nazis perceived to have been the failure of the previous Germany. I think. I mean, that's a thesis. I don't see that as a counter thesis to what you said, but I think there is also a longer learning process that goes, that we need to relate to what you've pointed out. So the second point is about totalitarian and fascist humor theorized, as it were. So if we take together these different examples, Italy, Germany, Soviet Union, and a few other can we? It's too ambitious and perhaps just doesn't go anywhere to think that we could find a way in which these different regimes thought of a unique form of fascist or totalitarian humour. But there are points when Orlando, when you talked about Stalin, and then Stephen, when you talked about Mussolini, and when we talk perhaps not about Hitler, but a number of other Nazi officials, again and again there was a temptation to say, well, there is this fascist form of laughter, denigrating, aimed to destroying the enemy, deeply satirical, sarcastic. Do we see? Does anyone theorize that? Do the Nazis tell themselves, well, in order to be a really strong and ruthless Himmler-type figure, you have to be able to laugh about your enemy, or push them into the dirt, but still laugh at them. Don't show you show weakness if you're serious. And do we see the Italian leadership thinking about a fascist form of ideologically correct, as it were, form of humor? Do the apparatchiks in the Soviet system think about a specific Soviet form of humor? And that matters because then we could see how they compare themselves to others. And for the 19th century, I have a vague answer, which is that the German ideologues and writers, authors such as Nietzsche, later on Müller-van den Broek, they had a clear idea that German laughter was different from other countries, and it had to do with the appreciation of the seriousness of the situation in which the German nation found itself. And then the third point comes back to, Orlando, what you thought was ultimately the question of the workshop, namely, how do we get to grips with power in these many different situations of laughter, of humor, of subversion, of sarcastic denigrating of enemies? Is every joke a tiny revolution? And Stephen, you had different, you sort of isolated different kinds of humours that you found under Mussolini, some institutional, some subversive, and then perhaps the uniquely intriguing character, Ettore Petrolini, who somehow dances between or on the borderline of these different forms of humour. He can be subversive, he can be deeply appreciative of the system's favours, and he would be one of the cases I suggest that we would need to study. We would need to find many Petrolinis in these different societies in order to work out where those different forms of humour and laughter intersect, where they meet, and what that tells us about the power relations in those societies. Because if we just assume that there are these sort of compartmentalized forms of humour, system-relevant, subversive, private, and so on, ultimately we don't get very far in working out what that tells us about the way where these societies go, whether the joking played a role towards the demise in the demise of the Soviet Union or not. It's really only by looking at where those different forms of humour intersect or collide that we could potentially stand a chance of finding out whether there is a relevance for those questions related to power. And that was that.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you.
I'm afraid I'm going to be a little bit Sinocentric in my responses, just drawing the conversation out of Europe and towards China, which is another example of a totalitarian state, which is, well, obviously people debate whether you can use the word totalitarian for China, but it's an authoritarian regime which is still in existence. So I think there might be some interest in drawing comparisons between these European examples and China. And what I noted in listening to these three very interesting papers is that there are elements of each of these case studies in China and in the Chinese state's attitude to sanctioned laughter, and they so they divide into sort of three. I'd like to make three different points, like Jan. The first point is about the use of coarseness and cruelty, which I think you could say is borrowed from the Soviet Union. Also, perhaps has its own sort of original birthplace in China as well. There's this attempt at extreme humourlessness that you see in fascism, this attempt to ban humour. We also see that in China. And finally, with reference to the Nazi Germany case study, this problem of how to clean up folk forms, clean up forms which have already been in existence, and to use them for new state purposes. So first of all, on the issue of coarseness and cruelty, Mao, as is well known, was a peasant. He was not an urban intellectual, and in his self-presentation, in his persona, you see a lot of this. I suppose peasant coarseness is still there right up to his very death. In the middle of the 1930s, he has an opportunity to present himself to the world. An American journalist called Edgar Snow comes to the communist state in northwest China, and Mao has an opportunity to present himself as he wants to the world via Edgar Snow. And the transcript of the interview is very interesting because Mao seems to be deliberately presenting himself as incredibly relaxed, disarmingly relaxed perhaps, and guileless. At one point, Edgar Snow describes how Mao takes off his trousers and starts picking lice out of them. So this was a man who was relaxed to the point of being coarse. On his first trip to the Soviet Union after the founding of the communist state in 1949, and of course the relationship with Stalin was a famously testy one, Mao is asked, what are you hoping to do while you're in the Soviet Union? And he says three things: I'm going to eat, I'm going to sleep, and I'm going to shit. Which sort of so he's able to, at really quite unpredictable moments, he seems to enjoy subverting situations, telling really very blue jokes, also at another Sino-Soviet summit, with mixed results. You see also, comparable with the Soviet Union, the use of laughter in public occasions in communist China to mock, to undermine enemies of the state. If you read Mao's speeches or the transcripts of mass struggle meetings from the early 1940s onwards, very deliberately in the transcripts, the amanuenses have included the words laughter in brackets, maybe so you realise that Mao has told a joke and it's time to laugh at that point. But also in the case of these show trials, which begin really in 1942 in significant numbers, you see the words mocking laughter, malicious laughter include there in order obviously to knock down the victim, to knock down the target, to sort of rob him of the right to rational response, and this coarseness and cruelty really gathers pace throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Again, this very interesting issue of what happens to humour when you remove a certain sort of freewheeling satire. This problem is also there in China. If you look at newspaper cartoons, particularly before 1911, but still sort of after 1911, between 1911 and 1949, they're far more like Private Eye than you might imagine. The cartoons poke fun at all sorts of sources of authority. So the question needs to be asked, what happens to that space? What happens to that need for laughter after 1949? And what you see is an incredibly violent style of political cartoons. So, the current enemy of the regime will be, being smashed by a worker with this sort of huge biceps and hammers. In order to remind myself of the violence of the Cultural Revolution, I keep by my computer a plastic toy which was sold in the 1960s. I'm sure those who have children will know about sort of squeaky toys which have a hole in the bottom you can play with in the bath. So the model, the mould which was used in China in the 1960s was a red guard, so a squeaky plastic red guard, rubber red guard, so Mao's stormtroopers effectively, and he is stepping on a snake with a human face, and that snake is Liu Shaoqi, who was the main target of Mao's purges in the Cultural Revolution. This is what Chinese children were playing with in their, well, not necessarily in their baths, but this was a toy directed at children. My second point is about the attempt to ban humour. Like fascist Italy, communist China was extremely suspicious of satire. In 1942, Mao gives his sort of key speech on the way that literature and art and culture should be produced in China. It's the talks at the Yan'an Forum, and he specifically draws an example of a writer called Lu Xun, who is, to draw a rough European analogy, perhaps China's Gorky, and who conveniently dies in 1936, never having met Mao. And soon after Lu Xun's death, Lu Xun is turned into a saint of the communist revolution. He's turned into a literary trophy for the communists. But Lu Xun is a really biting satirical writer. You wouldn't need the fingers of one hand to count the number of people that he managed to be consistently nice about in his life. He's a very, very angry, bitter satirist. And Mao, in 1942, though, he specifically says, Lu Xun's work has meaning outside the communist areas, but we do not need that satire in communist China because we are already living the perfect life. We don't need that. We don't need that kind of burning satire. And one of China's most noted satirists, Lao She, a novelist and a playwright who stays in China after 1949, inevitably he has trouble because his signature style is no longer possible. And so you end up reading his works and trying to work out, well, where is the satire here? Because he comes out with these glowing panegyrics to state propaganda. For example, the song "The East is Red," which the lyrics go, "The East is red, China has produced a Mao Zedong," and Lao She writes this sort of glowing encomium saying that this, as poetry, it is exquisite, quite exquisite. And you really have to look at that as, is he being satirical? Because then the danger of being satirical like that is not actually on the author himself, it becomes on the audience. If somebody in the audience says, surely you're being satirical, then the risk is to the person who's identifying it as satire rather than the person who's originally written it. And as I mentioned just after Orlando's talk, there is a massive explosion of satire and irony after Mao's death. First of all, in fiction, this is where a lot of the boundaries are being pushed in freedom of expression in China in the 1980s. And then when the internet becomes very, very widespread, this satire, this irony, for example, ironising state slogans, political thought. This moves on to the internet. And the third thing I wanted to say was this question about cleaning up folk forms. The communists are in fact fantastically skilled at using traditional forms of literature, whether sort of opera, fiction, but particularly obviously sort of visual forms and oral forms, and twisting the forms and adapting them to their own propagandistic purposes. And one form that they try to use is the form called xiangsheng, which is a comedy routine in the fine tradition of Little and Large. It's two men, usually one tall, thin one short, round one. And the origins of this form were obviously pretty risque. They were an outdoor form of entertainment. So these two performers, they would just set up stall somewhere public. But women weren't allowed to listen. So if women approached, they happened to be on their way shopping or whatever, the performers would just stop. They would fall silent and wait for the women to move on. So it was obviously seen as not the sort of thing that you'd want your wife, children and servants to hear. But xiangsheng is heavily adapted by the communists after 1949, but there is tremendous difficulty in cleaning it up, in sanitizing it, and there's you can see a debate going on in the 50s and 60s and 70s about whether it's appropriate to talk about certain issues in a humorous way, in a satirical way. For example, there's a big debate about a xiangsheng about America, in which the author is satirizing the FBI, and very concerned bureaucrats are saying, well, the FBI is really serious. You can't satirize this. And so I think what you see at work here is an intense distrust of audiences. This idea that audiences won't understand satire, that they will, if someone is light-hearted about the FBI, audiences will immediately assume that the FBI are a bunch of clowns. They're not terrifying American imperialists who are trying to bring the communist state down. And again, this is something which runs all the way through, in fact, 20th century China and its cultural reforms. This sense that audiences cannot be trusted. They have to be given heavily didactic things, because if you teach them about bandits, they will want to become bandits. If you teach them about sort of love affairs, they will immediately, throw out their wife and take up with a young thing in her 20s. I think those are the three parallels that I wanted to draw. So, Jane.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I'm not sure how many points I've got. You have to count it up in the end. Actually, I thought it was really interesting because you've got an even greater longevity to the regime, and so you can watch more transmutations going on in some respects. And also, very importantly, something which only just briefly made a reference here, and something that Steve said in response to Patrick's paper, was the conditions of production of these things, which I think is very important, and it's both the technical and social conditions of production, which I might come to say something about it towards the end. Like the others, I really wanted to respond to what had been said here, but I did do a bit of sort of reading and research beforehand to see where the terrain was, because when I first encountered the issue of humour in National Socialism, which is my field, it was all about the jokes. There was a very celebrated book that circulated in the 60s called Der Flüsterwitz of Dritten Reich. So this is like kind of, clandestine jokes in the Third Reich. And it was incredibly interesting and important, but no one quite knew what to do with it. And obviously, the field has moved on massively since then. And I was a bit distressed, but not entirely surprised to discover there's now a field called humorology, which I think is a joke in itself, frankly. But I think that what seems important about that, or what I drew from it by just thinking a little bit about what that meant and how the theorists have used it, is that they're also interested in the relationship between humour and emotions. And although emotions is not a field I'm particularly at home with, I'm not very comfortable with it as a historical field of study, I do think that it draws attention to the questions of subjectivity and intersubjectivity in this whole field, both in humour, in joke-telling, and in laughter. And of course, it's easier in some senses to look at this. The way it's been understood, I think, has been looking at what ordinary people, where their subjectivity was. But I presume there's also a way of doing that for the people who produce these things. I mean, just in response to something that Jan Ruger asked, which I'm sure Patrick knows much more about than I do, this question about, who said what about, when was laughter possible? I've forgotten the exact point you made, but I made it from reading something by Martina Kessler, who's worked together with Patrick on this subject. She cites Schwarzer Korps, the SS paper in 1936. I mean, this is pulled out of almost nothing, but saying only doubters never laugh. So providing a context, in other words, thoughtful, it draws our attention to the kind of person who could say that, okay, or the context in which that argument could be made. The other, so let's suppose that those who are in charge of this, of thinking about what's licit and what's illicit humour, have their own subjectivities involved in this very complicated question of what you think is funny, what is a joke, how a joke's produced, and so on. But I think it's also, it's not just, I very much appreciate that the framework of this event was to do with thinking about official humour, illicit humour as opposed to just illicit. And I think I've learned a lot from the papers today. But I think it's not just an alternative, sort of like, what's the regime saying about the people? What's the regime doing to the people? And what are the people? What's their relationship with the regime? Because there's a whole area which is the intersubjectivity of the people themselves. Okay, and this I draw especially from reading some work by a young man in Oxford who's just finished a doctorate on Soviet humour under Stalin, in which what he does a number of very interesting things with his material. It's probably the most deeply researched piece of work in English, I imagine. The conclusion he comes to is that what's most important is joke telling and humour as a means of communication among people, among citizens. He's interested not just in whether it gets him into trouble with the authorities, although obviously he has his own research on that, but he's very interested in the sort of spaces within which humour is deployed, for what purposes, but mainly it's to do with how communities of trust are formed, in which it's possible to produce this kind of speech. And I think that's what I mean by subjectivity and intersubjectivity. It's not just to do with the regime, in other words. The regime is there somewhere, okay, because otherwise you wouldn't have to bother to think about whether this was a good space or not. But it's a form of communication among people which is telling these people something about each other and not just about the regime. He makes up a number of other very important points, I think, which are helpful, but I think you should read his work. Everyone should read his work. The other thing, when you mention subjectivity, is the affinity which Jan Ruger noted in the article we published in History Workshop, and which Reinhard Koselleck, great German historian, noted in his afterword to another book which is much prized by German historians of National Socialism, which is this book, The Third Reich of Dreams, by Charlotte Berath. And Koselleck notes in his afterword that dreams and jokes, he's drawing on Freud, dreams and jokes share the same, they're in the same kind of area of economy, that they draw on some of the same sorts of mechanisms, and that they're worth looking at together. And I reread this just last night, had a quick look at it, to look particularly at this that I raised in relation to Steve's paper, which is where does silence come into in these dreams? Where are people unable to speak? I haven't got jokes that I want to tell, and I'm certainly not going to, start reading out these dreams. But a lot of dreams are about people's inability to speak, and I just wonder. The joke. It's really about what prompts these things. The joke is in some sense is always redundant. You don't have to tell a joke. You can communicate in other ways. But what prompts the joke is very interesting, and what prompts dreams. I think these, they reside in similar areas of the unconscious. Okay. The only other thing I think I want to say, and I'm going to tell a joke at the very end. I'm notoriously bad at telling jokes. When I was lecturing a lot to my students, I used to warn them a joke was coming, and they would always know the punchline would be fluff. But anyway, and they'd only get one a year. One of the things that strikes me is that official humour is not as funny as the jokes that circulate spontaneously. I have, from my parents, the album of Crocodile, which was produced in 1943, to circulate among members of the Anglo-Soviet Friendship Society, no doubt, and things like that. And it's just, most of the stuff that's in there is either very innocuous politically, or it's the kind of thing that Steve says you could find anywhere. You could just find, the same jokes that were in the fascist newspapers would be in here. Or not jokes, they're cartoons, basically. And then there are short stories which very, very, very gently poke a little kind of fun at, the character of the collective farm, the relationship between older generation and younger generation. But they're not, they're not as good as the collection of jokes that you would find in the clandestine joke in the Third Reich, or those German collections called the political joke, which I remember buying several of when I was a student. So, again, this is about, there's something about the gap between the licit humour and the illicit humour in terms of its sheer kind of ability to make you laugh, which is quite striking, I think. And I want to end with the joke that I'm going to fluff in the telling, because it's a response to the question of comparability across the genres. And this actually comes from John Waterlow's work. But the question is, could it have come from any of the other terrains, okay? And the scenario is that two secret... This is probably a joke that everybody knows, but anyway. That's, of course, always fatal. That's how I ruin my jokes. That's right. I've done it again. Two secret policemen meet, and one asks the other, what do you think of this regime? The other one got, put on the spot. What's he going to say? And he turns to the other chap who's asked the question, and says, same as you, comrade. And at that point, his interlocutor says, in that case, comrade, I'm under an obligation to arrest you. And I just wonder, I think that joke works very well. Yes, I have no alternative but to arrest you. It works very well for the Soviet Union. I'm not sure that it works so well for Nazi Germany, okay? There's something about the parallelism that I'm not absolutely certain about. I don't think it works at all for Italy. Anyway, that's my final word. So 3 points and a joke, probably.
Thank you very much, Jane. Well, we have some time left. I'd like to open it up for comments or questions, and then I think it might be best if we gather a few comments and questions before asking our panelists to respond. Although at this stage I just take one. Anthony.
I had a couple of points which I've been gathering over the course of the papers, and I think Jan has addressed some of those. But I want to come back to one of the common themes that has emerged in all three papers, and now in Julia. And that is this notion of cruel or coarse humour in something that is specific to fascist, Stalinist, or Nazi violent cultures of humiliation and using humiliation. And I ask two questions here. Really, in order to identify this as something specific to those particular systems, you need to have a comparison. I mean, do you find this elsewhere? And the answer would probably be, well, if you read transcripts of political meetings and so on and so forth, yes, you would get it. And more recently, in this context of Bouchard's, I read English papers coming over of Miliband's cutting remark about the clowns, okay, the circus of the clown in relation to Cameron and UKIP. Not quite sort of violent putting down that you might have had 30, 50, 60 years ago. So that's the first point I want to make. I'm a little bit uneasy about saying, well, these are, this is something that's specific to these three systems. Secondly, come back then to, and related to that, how much of this violent humour, humiliation, practices are the sort of thing that you would find among military and paramilitary cohorts. And then that leads me to the final point, which is it's gender specific. And that's something that really hasn't been discussed in so far. How much we're looking at a certain type of masculine or gendered sort of masculine type of humour. So that's just maybe a small contribution of observation.
I'll just abuse my position here just to add a minute. I think sort of Anthony's comparative point is exactly right. I mean, it would be interesting to look at, for example, American humour. Not just American humour in the interwar period, but precisely what you were saying about the sort of experience of war, whether the American Civil War, which sort of drew in and then threw out vast numbers of people, had similar consequences. Of course, both on, of course, you don't. I suppose the difference in those sorts of states is that you don't have illicit humour alongside the licit humour.
I just was wondering, is there any knowledge what's going on in North Korea? You say it's any kind of humour, anything going on there? Oh, nothing. I mean, I know nothing about it. Is there any knowledge about it?
It's a good question.
Coming back on Andy's point, I would like to endorse something that Julia said. I think there is something specific about this dynamic in totalitarian systems, and it made me think when you were talking, Julia. There's a line in Orwell's 1984 where he's saying what this totalitarian system should be like, and it should be a completely humorous place, except for the laughter of the triumph over the defeated. When you're stamping on the defeated, that's the only laughter you can have. So there's something about hatred, destruction, the power of the triumphant to laugh at the defeated. But that seems to me that's about totalitarians.
And it's there in Kafka's trial as well, I think, that the defendant is asked what he does and he gives an answer and everybody just roars with laughter. No, that's not what you do.
Interesting. I mean, I'm not disputing that. I just finished doing some work on Hitler's 23rd of March 1933 speech, which is, has all the characteristics of what you've been talking about. But I could equally go back to the Wiener period and find the speeches by Scheidemann and others, Reichscheid and so on, who also use humour to put down their political opponents, and it's the same sort of vitriol that you find. Obviously, the context is different, and there, I can see that.
There's a famous stump speech that Hitler gave everywhere in 1930. 30 or 32, I've forgotten which, but in the course of the presidential elections, probably 32, and it must be 32, and there's a film of where he's speaking, it's in Eberswalde, just outside Berlin, and he gives a very, very funny speech about the number of parties that exist in Germany, and it's actually quite funny. I mean, at the same time, the SPD has also got a propaganda film, a political propaganda film, which shows a kind of unending stream of papers, of parties, a huge long list of people you could vote for, parties you could vote for, which ends up, party for Meyer with an A and party for Meyer with an E. But Hitler satirises the same thing in a very entertaining way, actually, so that when you come to the punchline, which is that when we come to power, we will sweep all this lot away, you think, oh, that makes sense. You've seen this, right? I mean, perhaps other people here know, but it's actually a very uncharacteristic piece of propaganda for what we most, or piece of deployment of humour by Hitler. I'm not saying that to counter anything at all about his more familiar trope of like intense invective and yelling and so on. But it does show that, that humour was deployed in different contexts, and the context is very important. But I mean, the history of invective in German politics is quite intense, I think. So there are peculiar things about that. But
make a very quick response to this question about whether there is a link between militarisation of these regimes and the sort of coarse, cruel humour that they use. For example, in the case of China, Mao says in 1927 that power comes out of the barrel of a gun. So a lot of this mockery and this power to mock people and humiliate people, it is underpinned by military authority. But you also need to remember that Mao has in his service some of the most skilled, literate, highly educated people who in the 1930s they feel that the world, perhaps simplistically, that it's fascism versus communism, and they're going to join the communist cause. And in China, there's a saying which goes 文人相亲, which is literary people, educated people mock each other. This has a very, very long history, and so this history of belittling your enemies and your critics. It is used very energetically and also skillfully, but also very bitterly by Mao's most literate servants. And so, yes, the military aspect is very, very important, but these extraordinary wordsmiths that Mao has in his service, they shape the discourse too.
Would anyone else like to? Yes.
Could I venture a rather uninformed comment? I was very interested by Jan Kruger's suggestion that one needs more theorization of humour, perhaps to understand this area, because a couple of just unformed thoughts that occurred to me. Satire is destroying somebody, but it's also building yourself up, whereas I think we think of humour generally as more a corrective, as a balancing thing, and perhaps one needs a bit of psychological understanding of how they're using the humour, because obviously kind of the building up is typical of what we're calling state-sanctioned humour, whereas the subversive is obviously going to be the balancing corrective. But it would be very interesting to know more about that, or anybody's comments.
And then to relate that to what the actors at the time thought they were doing with laughter and humour, yeah.
Can I make just a tiny point on that? It's a very, very old trope, I think, because in the Bible, there's this distinction, I don't know if it's there in the language, between joyful laughter and mocking laughter, yeah? And so Isaac, which means laughter, the reason he's called Isaac is because his mother, is it Sarah or Rebecca? I forget which. Sarah. Rebecca, thank you.
No.
Sarah. Because she's astonished that she's conceived. And that's the expression of joyful laughter, or the hills laugh. I mean, that's the Psalms, wonderful. So there's this sense that there are two types of laughter is profoundly rooted in our culture. I don't mean it's like they're like a genetic inheritance of it, but it's culturally very, very profound, I think.
Did you want to say something?
I just I really liked your talking about intersubjectivity and joke telling, because I think that was mixed up a little bit. You cannot talk in the same way about media producing humor and joke telling, and it's clearly not the same. And in the German case, this joke telling thing is purely about intersubjectivity. Also, in the National Socialist regime, trying to ban it or trying to sentence people, they're not asking what joke they are telling, they're asking who's telling which joke, where, in which context, and they're sentencing only people that have a communist background or a Catholic background. If they are a party member, they're not sentenced to anything, and so that's totally different, and you cannot mix those two situations of going to a cinema and seeing a movie or reading a newspaper. and the joke-telling thing. So you have to really differentiate that. And I just wanted to say that I really like that.
Yes, please do.
I can't actually answer the North Korea question, but it is it's a very interesting one. Obviously, we know it is the hermit kingdom. Chinese tourists today, if they want to get a nostalgic hit for what China was like in the 50s or 60s, they go on a tour around North Korea. But I was just talking to somebody yesterday who, to them, they see North Korea as their past, 50s and 60s China. But I was talking to someone yesterday who was in China in the 1960s, a British academic, and she said that even back then, China was more open than North Korea was. You know, her students, she was teaching English, and her best students would go to Beijing Library of a Sunday afternoon and just read Shakespeare on their day off, and that was okay. This was in the first half of the 1960s, before the Cultural Revolution. So whatever China was, this is not a very scientific observation of mine, but whatever China was like in the 1960s, imagine it more so, and that is North Korea today. So the amount of control that you had then is intensified in North Korea.
Can I ask Orlando a question?
No, if what's your question?
I just wanted to add to Julia's comment about North Korea. I've seen a lot of photographic representations of the great leader of the time, surrounded by all these, generals, with they all kind of laughing around. So I'm sort of guessing that every time I saw that sort of picture, it must have been a great leader saying something sort of funny. And they're sort of, it's very much, the image that we have is very highly choreographed. So, the problem is that we don't actually know, whether it's purely a political thing, or, I expect in any society to exist, so I can't imagine it doesn't exist in North Korea, but it's just that the representations we see tend to be very sort of one-dimensional. Yeah, it's, I'm not Korean specialist, I can't really tell, but, sorry.
Jane, you had something?
Well, it was just this question about Radio Yerevan as a source of so many of those jokes. And what why was it? Was there a particular reason, or did they just have to choose one region and say this is where the jokes come from? But it was the sort of fictitious radio station that was responsible for all.
It was early 80s Radio Yerevan, or it was the Chukchi. So it was. It's the strangeness of someone who comes to our system from without. Therefore, I think we can sort of disclaim responsibility for seeing it this way, because it's someone who doesn't understand our system well enough from the inside.
So they're outsiders.
They're sort of outsiders, is my understanding of the Radio Yerevan thing, as it is with the Chukchi thing.
What does Chukchi mean? Is that?
Well, there's just a Siberian tribe.
Oh, I see. Right.
So,
yes.
So it was just like they come to Moscow and they can't understand why it works. So this is a good pretext to make a joke, as if it's a foreigner saying it, not one of us.
Oh,
I think. Yeah.
Could I just, make one point? I think it is absolutely fascinating to have these comparisons drawn. And, we can see sort of patterns form and differences. And I think that makes the day very, very useful. But also this sense of sort of going beyond the joke, looking at the context, the things that sort of are happening alongside it, and how it's being received. And I couldn't help but think about not laughs, but smiles. Because smiles are complicated in a way, more complicated, I think, than laughs. We've already had distinctions drawn just now by Jane, but more widely to different types and grades and purposes of laughter. But smiles are even more complex, I'm sure we can, all make a long list of types of smile, some of which enter the realm of humour, some of which are related more to mood, some of which are collective, and some of which are very much individual or interiorized. The smiling individual can be content, can also be laughing to him or herself. And I think when we look at all of these regimes, the photographs, the photographic material, both the leaders, the officials, the pictures of the crowds, particularly perhaps in encounters with leaders, it is absolutely fascinating to look at the smiling that's going on, this open mouth, closed mouths, whether the dictators themselves are smiling. I think there's, it's a sort of, it's not exactly our theme today, but it sort of comes in, just sort of overlaps with it a little bit, and I think that there's a wider set of issues there, which perhaps also could be reflected on.
Would anyone else? I think we'll have to get Colgate to sponsor that project. And that would be great, Steve. Thank you. Excellent. I feel a real confidence of coming around.
So enterprising.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I will just conclude, first of all, by saying, by reminding us all that today it's been the upshot of a collaboration between the Pears Institute at Birkbeck and the Wiener Library, where we are here, and how marvellous it has been to have enjoyed these presentations and this discussion, surrounded by the cartoons of Stephen Roth, and how appropriate that has been. But I'd also like to thank not only our panellists at this oblong table, but the speakers through the day for just opening up what is clearly an emerging subject, although perhaps one soon to be eclipsed by the history of the smile. Thank you all very much.